The movie opens with a man stealthily hiding a gun in the cast on his right hand. He locks onto his target and sets his sights on completing the mission. However, before he could fire, another killer appeared on the scene, causing chaos. The man was the first to spot the killer's location and charged toward him, unleashing a barrage of gunfire. The killer could not fight back and was soon surrounded by police cars. The large gun in his hand made it impossible for him to escape, and he was forced to surrender. But the killer had other plans. As he was being transported in a police car, he managed to break his thumb and slip out of his handcuffs. In a moment of quick thinking, he kicked out the window and killed the police officer driving the car. The car careened out of control, flipping over. The other police cars, realizing something was wrong, turned back to investigate. But the killer had already taken cover inside one of the cars, shooting at the officers and successfully escaping. He retired from his life of crime, never to be seen again. As Michael got into the car, he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. However, as they drove, he realized they were heading in the wrong direction. Michael noticed the driver intentionally taking a long detour after he saw the driver's ID that had been torn off. He immediately called out Robert's name, and they both drew their guns, but the bulletproof glass separating them rendered their threats meaningless. Robert knew that Michael had recognized him, which meant that his actions had been specifically targeted at him. If Robert didn't have a personal grudge against Michael, then that meant someone else had hired him. But Michael wouldn't reveal the identity of his employer. Robert pulled the car over to the side of the road and waited for Michael to give him some answers. But then Michael did something unexpected. He turned his gun towards the window and shot the soccer ball out of the air. He threatened Robert to keep driving, or he would shoot a random person on the field. Robert didn't want to hurt any innocent bystanders, so he did as he was told. Michael had planned to keep him distracted while he figured out a way to kill him. But Robert was no ordinary victim. He accelerated his car until it was right alongside the truck, pinning Michael against it until he dropped his gun. Reluctantly, Robert let him go, and by this time, the police had arrived and were launching a full-scale assault on their location. Michael took the opportunity to jump out of the truck and flee. Robert became the target of the police's tracking efforts, but he remained calm and drove his taxi into a cab stand. From there, he left as a passenger in another cab. After returning home, Robert confronted the middleman, asking why two assassins had been sent on the same mission. It was highly unusual for this to happen on the island. The middleman claimed not to know the situation but offered him a new job as compensation, which came with a $2 million payout. The target was an internationally known hacker named Ilyar, who was said to have a confidential disk. Ilyar was planning to sell the disk to several buyers, and Robert's mission was to take out both the seller and the buyers. It was a tempting offer, and he accepted the job and put off his retirement for a little while longer. Meanwhile, Ilyar was at home, leisurely playing with her cat. The couple downstairs was arguing, but Ilyar was too focused on the surveillance camera in front of her to pay them much attention. As a loner, she took pleasure in watching the drama unfold. Ilyar had almost no social life and enjoyed spying on other people's lives as daily entertainment. On the day of the deal, she dressed in her finest clothing and headed to the hotel. She didn't plan on meeting the buyer in person, instead negotiating the sale details over the intercom. When it was time to exchange the deposit, a money truck appeared in the air vent above the buyer's room. As the remote-controlled cart filled with cash, Ilyar happily began transmitting the files to the other party. But unbeknownst to Ilyar, both Robert and Michael had tracked her down. Michael burst into the buyer's room and swiftly took out all enemies with his double guns. Within 5 seconds, all of the threats were eliminated. Realizing something was amiss, Ilyar cut off the transmission and frantically stuffed her cat into her bag, preparing to run for it. But as she was leaving her house, she was confronted by Robert. He had heard Michael's voice on the walkie-talkie and deduced that the buyer had been killed. His mission was to take the disc and eliminate Ilyar, but when he looked into her eyes, he hesitated. Instead of killing her, he took her to the underground garage and left her in his car. Ilyar was panicked, aware that the man in front of her was dangerous. In desperation, she sped up the car and suddenly stopped at the side of the road near a fence. She grabbed her cat bag and ran away, leaving Robert trapped in the car on the other side of the fence. Ilyar's reckless escape attempt cost her valuable time. She was running blindly and looking over her shoulder when she accidentally collided with a passerby and dropped her cat bag. Robert was hot on her heels, and she desperately climbed onto a passing bus to escape him. She watched as Robert picked up her beloved cat from her vantage point. Robert returned to Ilyar's car and found a bag from a pet supply store in the corner. This led him to take the cat directly to the pet store. The owner recognized the little feline immediately and asked Ilyar why she wasn't there today. With this information, Robert was able to obtain Ilyar's address. Meanwhile, Michael had also tracked down the hotel room where Ilyar had been staying and found some forgotten photos. By examining the photos' backgrounds, he could quickly locate Ilyar's house. As Ilyar was packing her things and preparing to flee, she glanced at the surveillance feed and saw that Michael had arrived at the male neighbor's house downstairs, searching door to door for her. Ilya was frozen when her kitty ran into the room, closely followed by Robert. Robert told Ilya to come with him if she wanted to live. With no other options, she agreed, and Robert dropped her off at the pet store before following shortly after. Michael had found Ilya's surveillance system and tore it down, following the wires to her room. When he arrived, the room was empty. He searched around, even going so far as to open and smell the perfume on the table. By this time, Robert had already returned, and the two men were locked in a fierce battle, each trying to kill the other. Ilya, who had managed to escape, happened to pass by her neighbor's car downstairs. She couldn't bear the thought of an innocent person being caught up in the violence and rushed back to intervene. However, as she approached her house, the neighbor noticed that the surveillance wires had been ripped down from the ceiling and went to Ilya's house to ask for an explanation. Tragically, she was killed on the spot by Michael, mistaking her for Ilya. Robert intercepted Ilya and narrowly avoided the same fate. Realizing he couldn't win the fight, Robert pulled out the gas line and poured the liquid on the ground, creating a barrier between himself and his opponents. By the time Michael realized that something was amiss, it was too late. He panicked onto a table, trying to resist the heat wave, but he was still thrown out the window and tumbled downstairs. Robert tried to chase after him, but Michael had vanished. He fled to his home and contacted the middleman to report on the mission's progress. The seller and the buyer had been taken care of, but Robert now had the disc. Michael needed more time to complete the missions, but the middleman didn't agree to it. Without the disc, it didn't matter who lived or died. The job would be given to someone else because Michael could not complete it. Michael glared at the screen in frustration. Meanwhile, Robert was staying at a hotel with Ilya, and the little cat had grown attached to him, following him around like a little tail. Robert knew that Michael had been responsible for ruining his last two missions, and he suspected that the middleman was somehow involved. He contacted the middleman and asked about Michael, but he refused to answer, simply telling him to bring the disc to the usual drop-off location. The middleman didn't mention the buyer or the seller, which indicated to Robert that he had already been in contact with Michael. He must have known that the buyer was dead, but that didn't matter. At least Ilya was no longer a target. Robert proposed a deal to Ilya. They would work together to sell the disc in exchange for a fee of $2 million, to be split evenly between them. Ilya eagerly agreed, remembering that she had only originally planned to sell the discs for $40,000 in the hotel deal. She had hoped to use the money to find a boyfriend for her kitty. One day, Ilya drove Robert to the deal to sell the disc. Robert expertly made the exchange and took the money. Suddenly, he triggered the train's emergency brake and jumped off, while Ilya was waiting for him on the ground. Once they were on the train, they were relieved. But their happiness was short-lived when they heard the sound of electricity coming from the box containing the money. Robert's face changed, and he urgently asked Ilya to drive to a remote alleyway. He quickly tossed the box into a dumpster, and they fled the scene. 3 seconds later, the box exploded. Robert was shocked, but Ilya wore a mysterious smile. She had never trusted Robert's so-called middleman and had come up with a plan from the start. The disc she had given Robert was empty, the real classified disc was still with her. Furious, Robert sent a direct message to the middleman, demanding $20 million in exchange for the discs. The middleman knew he had no choice but to agree. However, he needed time to gather the funds and promised to transfer the money to Robert's card in 2 days. Then, the middleman approached Michael with a new assignment. This time, Michael was more hesitant to agree, and the middleman had to compromise to secure his services. Michael's new mission was to target Robert. The next day, Robert went to the plain building across the street from the bank, knowing that Michael would likely choose it as a sniper's nest. As he stood there, memories flooded him from 10 years ago. He had killed his old friend Ketchem from this same spot. As a killer, he wasn't supposed to have feelings, but the guilt of that act had tormented him for years. As he grew older, it became harder to resist his actions' weight. That was why he had decided to retire. The day of the deal had arrived. At noon, Robert entered the bank while Ilya sat in the coffee shop, watching the abandoned building. Michael reported to the abandoned building, assembling his sniper rifle and waiting for Robert to emerge from the bank. He planned to take the killing shot as soon as Robert appeared. Time passed by as Michael waited, his face sweating in the hot summer heat. But Robert didn't come out. The agent had assured him there was no back door to the bank, so Robert must still be inside. Michael couldn't afford to be distracted, knowing he was facing the ace of the hit squad. If he wasn't careful, he could end up dead. After learning that the $20 million had arrived, Robert told the bank staff that he wanted to withdraw and close his account. The bank manager was excited at the prospect of making a large number of fees from such a large transaction. However, the process took a long time due to the amount of money involved. While Robert waited, he enjoyed the bank manager's service, eating food, blowing on the air conditioner, and flirting with Ilya through the headset. A few hours passed, and Michael felt like the hot air was roasting him. He couldn't take it anymore and decided to hide his car and sneak into the bank to see what was happening. Ilya waited for Michael to leave before running into the airplane building to search for his gun. She found it hidden in the ceiling, but when she tried to take it down, it slipped out of her hand. As Michael sneaked back into the bank, he saw that Robert was withdrawing his money. Satisfied with this information, he turned to leave. But as he was walking out, he heard the sound of footsteps and realized that Ilya was inside the building. He retrieved his gun and locked the entrance to the bank before turning to face her. However, when he saw the headset on Robert's ear, he realized that he had been duped and decided to retreat, escaping from the building and onto the roof. As he lay there, wounded and bleeding, he saw Robert and Ilya emerge from the building. He waited for them to approach to catch a glimpse of his killer. But instead, he saw a familiar figure emerge from the shadows. It was Ketchum, the man he had killed 15 years ago. Robert was shocked to see his old friend alive. As it turned out, Ketchum had been a top assassin who disguised himself as a middleman to hide his true identity. He had given Robert the task of killing him to erase his past completely. With the truth revealed, Robert knew he had no choice but to finish the job and end Ketchum's life once and for all. As the realization of his guilt washed over him, Robert couldn't help but glance at Michael, who was lying on the ground, feigning unconscious. It was all just a joke to him. They both decided to shoot Ketchum and end his life at that moment. But their confrontation was far from over. Robert knew he had to confront Michael and tell him their interests were not aligned. Robert said he just wanted to retire. Despite his words, Michael raised his gun as soon as Robert turned his back. Deep down, he knew he could never truly be number one as long as Robert was alive. As Ilya slipped on her sunglasses, Robert knew that it was time for him to leave this life behind. He didn't even turn back to seek revenge on Michael. Instead, he retired with $20 million and the woman he loved, Ilya, by his side. Together, they lived a happy life, leaving the past and all its darkness behind. The moral lesson of the story is that greed and the desire for power can lead to betrayal and destruction.